Good. So let me welcome everyone. We have a excellent attendance, and I'm Jeff Lammy. I'm president of the AIA New York Society, and we're going to basically do two things. In the beginning, we're going to have an annual meeting for the New York Society, and I had previously sent out to everyone and all the members an agenda with a lot of detail that we're going to cover. Subsequent to the annual meeting, we will move into our lecture this evening. So again, please make sure your mics are all muted. And with respect to the annual meeting, there will be muting until the Q&A, which can be done by, under reactions in your lower screen, there's a function which permits you to click on that and to raise your hand, which we will use from time to time. So moving into the agenda that I set out, calling the meeting to order, I had sent out last year's minutes of a digital meeting. Again, the COVID has caused digital meetings to happen continuously here now. So the minutes come to this meeting as a motion from the board. Do I have a second, please? And you can raise your hand and so move. Second. Just raise your hand. Okay, as a second. And therefore, all in favor, you can put in the reactions. You'll see when you click on it, raise hand. If you would do that, I would appreciate it. And that'll give me an idea as to what's going on. Okay, thank you very much. Let me move now to the treasurer's report, and I'll pass it over to John Yarmick, who's our New York Society treasurer. So, John.
Okay, I'm not sure how to
share screen.
Yeah, I'm not. Hopefully, you all have the financials that were sent out. So I'm not sure how to get my screen.
You could just comment them in general.
Right. Basically, we are still doing very nicely in terms of our financial picture. We finished the fiscal year with an operating surplus of $1,555, a bit lower than last year's operating surplus, but these surpluses, of course, are due to two important reasons. First, on the income side, we have some generous donors in the Friends program who provide us and have provided us, and as you can see, in fiscal 21, provided us with $8,450, a bit lower than the year before, but still very nice, and really can take care of our expenses, especially because of the second reason. In a virtual world, our expenses have been greatly reduced, especially the lecture programs. Last year, $1,903. In prior years when we had in-person lectures, it was $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 because of expenses associated with putting on receptions and in a few cases renting space. So as long as we have been virtual, and this fiscal year, current fiscal year, we are also going to continue to be virtual, so these expenses will be held in check. I think the expense item that is noteworthy is the New York Scholars Program, and I think Jeff will probably talk a little bit more about that and the success we've had in that program. And you'll see the expense of $1,930 because this year that fiscal year, we were able finally to give out our first scholarship, which is embedded in that expense. And this fiscal year will probably have two scholarships because we did miss a year due to the pandemic. There is a fairly large other expense and other contribution item which are offsetting each other. We had a liability insurance policy, and because of the pandemic and the fact that we were not meeting in person, we suspended that liability insurance policy, and so we paid for the policy and the expenses, and we were reimbursed most of it in the income. And as you can see at the bottom of that page, which gives our balances, we have a nice savings account, and we have the helped endowment, which, thanks to the good capital markets that we had in that fiscal year, we see it has grown very nicely. We have not drawn, largely because of the limited expenses that we've incurred. So we've been able to allow the endowment to grow. Well, that's about it. I'm anticipating that we'll see a comparable result for fiscal 22. Does anyone have any questions? Okay.
Thank you, John. Going back now to the, presumably I'm now on the screen, I hope, and not John.
You're on the screen. You're on my screen.
Okay, good. Just continuing with the agenda, which I had said, we had a very successful lecture season, fall of 2020 to the spring 2021, as I noted, and we were generally 60 to 70 attendees per lecture, although we had over 2,500 views for an Egyptology lecture because we partnered with the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And again, the listing of all of our lectures is always in our newsletter, which is sent out to everyone, or you can watch for email announcements, or you can always go to the New York Society website, www.aia-nysociety.org. The New York Society Scholars Program, which John mentioned, we're now in our third year, and this is an attempt to foster the archaeological careers of students in the New York University and college area. And we've had 3 cohorts, so the third one now, and it's been a very successful. The professors are the ones who initiate, the students then apply, and so it works out very well. This year in our third cohort, and I would like to recognize a number of them. Before I do that, joining us this evening as one of the attendees is Jasmine Smith, who's at the IFA from NYU, and she was a scholar from our second cohort. This year's third cohort awardees, which are all part of our attendance this evening, are Ms. Balarao at ISA, and Ilyamani Castro from NYU, Braden Cordivari from ISA also, Kristen Delatour from City College, CUNY, Letitia Lobato Godioso from the College of Staten Island, CUNY, and Carrie Ann Matthews from NYU. Pam Crabtree was a recommender, as was Antonis Kotsonas, who's also a board member. And so we thank them very much, along with Matthew Riley. So it's an excellent cohort of up to 6 scholars, and they will all receive a free membership in the AIA if they decide to go to and participate in the annual meeting this year, which will be held in mid-January. Then again, we'll be willing to help them with the cost of that, as well as their eligibility to apply for our fieldwork scholarship, which is $1,500. And as John mentioned, we did disperse our first fieldwork scholarship this past year for a project in Crete, which you saw in our annual in the newsletter. The major item for this year's are elections for governance. Joanne Spurza, who has been crucial on our New York Society Scholars Program and leads the committee which judges and awards the New York Society Scholars. She's going to step up from being a general trustee to being vice president. It'll be her first term. And these nominations that I'm listing come to you as a nomination from the board. As a general trustee, John Yarmick, our current treasurer, will step down and become a general trustee, leaving the treasurer's slot open, which remains to be filled. Francesco De Angelis, who is a professor, noted professor in archaeology and art history at Columbia. And he will, in the back of the package that was sent out to everyone, there are a listing of various credentials of the folks. And he's a professor and chair of the Classical Studies graduate program at Columbia. He works at Hadrian's Villa. And so that's important. And we have a new lady joining our board, Gina Tibbett, who's a ceramicist and specialist in both Roman pottery and archaeological illustration. And again, I sent out a listing of various credentials that she has. She's worked in excavation and illustration related to Pompeii and won some awards from the AIA itself. So these nominations come as I say, as a nomination from the board. Do I have a second? Please raise your hand. Again, you can raise your hand. Thank you. I see a second. If you hit on the reactions, you can see your hands, etc., on raising them. So all in favor, please raise your hand appropriately. Okay, thank you. And I have no other business. If there are people who would like to ask a question, please enter it in the chat and I will try and answer. If there's no other business, then I will adjourn the meeting and I thank you all, and we will move on to tonight's lecture. Again, we will handle the lecture, the Q&A at the end. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen that there is a chat function. You can put your questions in the chat, and at the end, we will, the speaker will answer your questions. Tonight's lecture is called, it's a national AIA lecture, and it's called a Brush Lecture. Many of you may not be aware there was a Dr. Charles Brush III. He and his children and friends established a lectureship in 1999 in memory of his wife, Ellen Sparry Brush. Mrs. Brush was an AIA general trustee, and she served on many AIA committees and was interested in, as is Dr. Charles himself, in Mesoamerican topics. So the endowment was for a lecture on Mesoamerican topics and to be delivered in New York City. And the New York Society is very pleased to have this ability to have a New World Archaeology lecture every year. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Andrew Finegold, is an assistant professor of art history at the University of Illinois in Chicago. He received his BA summa cum laude in fall of 2004 from the University of Houston, his MA, MPhil, and PhD from Columbia University, specializing in pre-Columbian art. And since 2016 has been at the University of Illinois, Chicago as an assistant professor. He has taught at other places, Skidmore, Wake Forest, and Columbia as itself. His awards and recognition are considerable from the College Art Association and from others. He also has publications, has a book in progress now called The Temporalities of Art in Mesoamerica, and has been accepted for publication, an article in a forthcoming book, Mesoamerican Ceramics, and also an article in a book on worlds within Mimbres pottery of the ancient Southwest, and has a book published by the University of Texas in Vital Voids, Cavities and Holes in Mesoamerican Material Art, Culture. He has spoken and given talks to the AIA in Toronto, to quite a number of meetings of the College Art Association, the International Congress of Americanists, the Midwest Conference on Mesoamerican Archaeology and Ethnology, the Society for American Archaeology, and others. So he's quite an expert on Mesoamerican topics. And tonight's lecture, I'm sure, will be quite interesting and informative, entitled Vitality Materialized on the Piercing and Adornment of the Body in Mesoamerica. And so with that, I will turn the screen over to Dr. Finegold.
Hi, everybody. Can you all see my screen and see me, hopefully? Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really an honor to be giving the 2021 Brush Lecture to the New York Society of the Archaeological Institute of America. I'll just dive right in because we had the annual meeting ahead of time. I just want to let you know, if there's not enough time to get to everybody's question, I'll have my email up at the end on the last slide, and you can feel free to reach out to me if I'm not able to get to your question in the time that we have. But you can also enter your questions in the chat, and I'll try to answer them at the end of the talk. Today's talk is part of the 5th chapter of my recently published book, Vital Voids, that Jeff mentioned, from the University of Texas Press this year. It's a condensed version of the chapter, and it deals with perforations in the body. In a letter written to Pope Leo X in 1519 or 1520, Peter Martyr d'Angera described the 6 Totonac Indians he encountered in the Spanish court of Charles V, where they had been sent by Hernan Cortés along with his first letter. Quote, "Both sexes pierce the ears and wear golden pendants in them. The men pierce the extremity of the under lip down to the roots of the lower teeth. Just as we wear precious stones mounted in gold upon our fingers, so do they insert pieces of gold the size of a ring into their lips. This piece of gold is as large as a silver carolus and thick as a finger. I cannot remember ever to have seen anything more hideous, but they think nothing more elegant exists under the lunar circle. This example proves the blindness and the foolishness of the human race. It likewise proves how we deceive ourselves. The Ethiopian thinks that black is a more beautiful color than white, while the white man thinks the opposite. A bald man thinks himself more handsome than a hairy one, and a man with a beard laughs at him who is without one. We are influenced by passions rather than guided by reason, and the human race accepts these foolish notions, each country following its own fancy." End quote. This account is notable for prefiguring by over 2.5 centuries Immanuel Kant's recognition that although they are experienced and expressed as universal truths, aesthetic judgments are subjective and reflect culturally specific sentiments. What disgusts Peter Martyr is not the practice of adorning the body with precious stones, which he notes is also done in Europe, but rather the fact that the Totonacs wear these jewels embedded within the flesh of their faces. Marveling at the contrast between the Indian's standard of beauty and his own, he nevertheless stops short of probing these different aesthetic responses, instead writing them off with appeals to other examples based on natural conditions such as skin color or the presence or lack of hair. However, divergent attitudes towards body modifications do not arise from innate differences in appearance, nor are they mere matters of taste or preference. Rather, they can be understood in relation to the underlying world views of these two civilizations. Peter Martyr's repulsion towards facial piercings derives from a Judeo-Christian theology and morality in which humans, having been created in the image of God, sin against their maker by permanently altering the appearance and integrity of their bodies. In Mesoamerican cosmology, on the other hand, all things, organic and inorganic, including human beings, participate within an emergent field of relations that are in a constant state of renewal and transformation. The practice of bodily adornment in Mesoamerica can only be fully understood with respect to this worldview. Much recent scholarship has been conducted on Mesoamerican jewels, including the particular qualities and attributes of the materials from which these precious objects were made, and their place within the indigenous worldview. This paper takes a complementary approach to such studies by considering the material and ontological implications of the fleshy piercings through which some ornaments were articulated with the human body. Unlike the jewels themselves, which were often made of durable materials that survive archaeologically and are able to be closely studied in the present, the holes into which they were placed are doubly immaterial, negative spaces in flesh that has itself long since deteriorated. While these circumstances have led to a privileging of the ornaments as objects of scrutiny, I argue that acts of piercing and the somatic voids they produced were integral and meaningful aspects of adornment in Mesoamerica. In addition to creating spaces to accommodate jewels, the perforation of the body was an activity that carried social significance, most notably in the form of auto-sacrificial bloodletting, but also in rituals that accompanied coming-of-age ceremonies and accession rites. Such interventions into the human body should be viewed as a continuum of related behaviors, in that holes made within the flesh served as a conduit for the flow of life and vitality. Placed within them, ornaments did more than merely indicate the wearer's status. They drew attention toward, alluded to, and made tangible and permanent the vital potency of the fleshy holes they occupied, and, by extension, the charisma of the bodies that hosted them. Within the Mesoamerican worldview, interventions within or upon the flesh could both enact and reflect the changing configurations of material relations in which people participated. As in Europe, the wearing of jewelry in Mesoamerica was done as a means to demonstrate wealth and social status. Sumptuary laws enforced by the Aztecs, and possibly by other groups, declared that certain types of adornment were only allowed to be worn by select categories of people, making them visible metonyms for rank, standing, or personal achievement. Raw materials such as gold, greenstone, turquoise, and rock crystal, among others, were relatively rare and often only obtainable through long-distance trade or tribute. Yet, as much recent research has shown, these materials were not only valued for their scarcity, but also for their physical properties, sensual attributes, and qualitative associations. Their glinting surfaces gave the impression that they possessed active properties, and their colors were identified with aspects of the natural world associated with life and growth. The green of foliage and abundance, the golden yellow of the sun, or the clear of fresh water. These qualities were not merely metaphorical, but were understood to be intrinsic to the essence of these materials. In discussing the ways deposits of precious stones were located, the informants of Bernardino de Sahagún state that those who know what to look for, quote, know where it is, They can see that it is breathing, smoking, giving off vapor. Early, at early dawn, when the sun comes up, they find where to place themselves, where to stand. They face the sun, and when the sun has already come up, they are truly very attentive with looking. They look with diligence. They no longer blink. They look well. Wherever they can see that something like a little smoke column stands, that one of them is giving off vapor, this one is the precious stone. Perhaps it is a coarse stone, perhaps it is a common stone, or something smooth or something round. They carry it away. And if they are not successful, if it is only barren where this little column of smoke stands, thus they know that the precious stone is there in the earth. Then they dig. There they see, there they find the precious stone, perhaps already well formed, perhaps already burnished. Perhaps they see something buried there, either in stone or in a stone bowl or a stone chest. Perhaps it is filled with precious stones. This they claim there. And thus they know that this precious stone is there. The herbs always grow fresh, they grow green. They say this is the breath of the green stone, and its breath is very fresh. It is an announcer of its qualities. In this manner is seen, is taken, the green stone. End quote. This passage describes precious stones as possessing qualities that were manifested even when their surfaces were unpolished or when they were still buried within the earth. Even when it was hidden or invisible, green stone had an inner vitality, exuded as its breath, that could be detected in the rising mists at sunrise and which caused the foliage in the surrounding earth to grow fresh and green. That is to say, the living stone was understood to interact with its environment and affect its surroundings. Once extracted and worked, the vivid coloration and hard, glistening surface of polished greenstone, as well as the floral forms into which it was often carved, visibly manifested qualities that the material had exuded even when it remained unworked and unseen. As with other aspects of the natural world, the externally visible attributes of greenstone were therefore understood to arise directly from the internal character of the material. According to the categorization devised by Charles Sanders Peirce, this type of relationship between a sign and its referent is indexical. In contrast to the icon, which signifies through a similarity of resemblance, and the symbol, which signifies through purely arbitrary convention and usually denotes a general concept, the index is a concrete sign that denotes by virtue of being really affected by that object to which it refers. Beyond being mere qualities, the external features of precious materials such as greenstone resulted from and served as indices for the inner life and vitality of these substances. In the Mesoamerican mind, a dynamic indexical relationship existed between visible appearances as signs and the invisible attributes that they pointed to. Moreover, in their affective materiality, objects were understood to belong to an unfolding chain of indexical signification as they exerted influence upon or were further influenced by their surroundings. Based on early colonial accounts and more recent ethnographies, we can be more precise about the ways the invisible, agentive life forces that imbued the material world were conceptualized in Aztec thought. For example, the fact that precious stones buried within the earth were looked for at sunrise draws a correspondence between the potency attributed to them and tonali, a Nahuatl term referring to the heat given off by the sun, but also that which is present in the blood of living creatures. Tonali was understood to be an animating force that bound together the fates of terrestrial beings and celestial bodies. Constantly in flux, it could be concentrated, as in highly charismatic individuals, or dissipated, as with the waning of vigor towards the end of life. It also infused inorganic materials, especially those whose surfaces shone brightly when touched by the light and heat of the sun. Gold, Teoquitlat, or divine excrement, was particularly associated with tonali. Thought to be deposited within the earth by the sun as it rose, it was a material condensation of vital solar energy. Gold ornaments were often formed with numerous facets or moving parts to better accentuate their glittering surfaces, which were visible demonstrations of the tonali that they possessed. Just as the ways gold and precious stones were worked revealed qualities inherent within the material, a tautological equivalence was established between elites and the noble materials with which they were adorned. Jewels served to identify the wearer as noble because they were understood to be indexically correlated to, or even manifestations of, the tonali contained within the body of the individual. Although Sahagun's informants tell us that this association between the precious materiality of jewels and the noble character of the adorned held true no matter how they were worn, even if it was in a superficial manner, such as with necklaces or bracelets, the embedding of ornaments within the body undoubtedly made this conflation all the more explicit. Piercing the flesh to open a hole for this purpose would inevitably result in the drawing of blood, the precious fluid that, in its warmth and movement through the body, was closely identified with the solar heat of tonali. In Mesoamerica, the body was regularly perforated for the sole purpose of ritualized bloodletting, and piercing for adornment could not have failed to evoke this practice. Indeed, although these bodily treatments are usually discussed as being separate and distinct, there is good reason to believe that a significant conceptual overlap existed between the practice of piercing the flesh in bloodletting rituals and the production of somatic holes intended to accommodate jewelry. Before this argument can be made, however, the roles of auto-sacrificial bloodletting in Mesoamerica need to be more fully addressed. The perforating of the body and offering of one's own blood appears to have been one of the most widespread ritual acts in Mesoamerica, dating back to at least the Middle Formative period. It is attested to by the presence of implements used for this purpose in the archaeological record, by imagery depicting auto-sacrificial activities, and by 16th century accounts as well as more recent ethnographic records. A variety of materials such as cactus spines, thorns, obsidian needles, and stingray spines were used to puncture the flesh at different points in the body, including the ears, tongue, elbow, penis, thighs, shin, and calves. The blood that was produced in this manner was understood to feed the gods as part of a consumptive cosmology. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world, and they in turn required continual nourishment to sustain it. Thus, auto-sacrifice was an obligation on both sides with the constant and reciprocal flow of life energies. The Nahuatl word nextlawali, meaning payment, was used to describe sacrifice of all sorts, making explicit its status as a remittance of a debt. Another Nahuatl term closely associated with bloodletting is tlamasewalitzli, which means to merit or deserve something. Cecilia Klein sees this as relating to the inherent reciprocity that underpinned the act, both between the humans and the gods, and between the lower classes and the elites. This term was also translated as penance by the 16th century Spanish friars, likely as the closest fit to convey Christian doctrine to the newly converted indigenous population. And Michel Graulich has argued that for the Aztecs, sacrifice was at its core an expiatory cleansing of sins. The Maya word most closely associated with bloodletting is chab, a complex term for which it has proven difficult to find an entirely adequate translation into English. Chab roughly means penance or penitence, and it is used specifically to refer to fasting in a number of Mayan languages. A literal link between fasting and bloodletting may be posited. Certainly, it must have been the case that practicing the drawing of cords through tongues would have resulted in a reduced intake of food, just as the drawing of a cord through the penis would have created a wound necessitating a period of sexual abstinence. Stephen Houston, however, has recently argued that this term conveys a more general sense of ritual abnegation leading to a desired outcome. that is, as a form of spiritual preparation. Complicating things, the Yucatec cognate for this word means both to abstain or to do penance and to create or to make things from nothing. Finally, chab was used as part of parentage statements in some classic period inscriptions. This overlay of usages has led Timothy Knowlton to propose Genesis as the English word that best captures its nuances. Through the interrelated meanings associated with this term, we can begin to get a sense of what chab indicated in statements related to auto-sacrificial bloodletting. According to Jessica Munson and her colleagues, one out of 89 instances of this glyph in classic Maya inscriptions, 69 appeared to be directly associated with bloodletting. There is thus a close but imprecise association with its usage and bloodletting rituals. And chab is used to refer to non-bloodletting contexts slightly less than a quarter of the time. On lintel 24 at Yaxchilan, we see it applied to both depicted figures. The ruler, Shield Jaguar III, who stands to the left holding a torch, and his wife, Lady Kabal Shok, who kneels to the right as she draws a thorny cord through her tongue. The text related to the ruler states in part that it is his image in penance, that is chab, with the fiery spear. It is the penance of the four Khatun Lord, Shield Jaguar III. While the inscription related to Lady Kabal Shok simply states that it is her image in penance, or chab, before giving her name and titles. Thus, while depicted auto-sacrificial ritual of the noble woman, while the depicted auto-sacrificial ritual of the woman is referred to as a chab event, Shield Jaguar III, who is not shown engaged in bloodletting, is twice associated with the same term, once explicitly in reference to the torch that he holds. The deictic marking of the text, the claim that it is his image in penance, ubati chab, strongly implies that the inscription refers specifically to what is shown in the associated image. Chab was often paired with the term akab, or darkness, to form a diphrastic couplet that further complicates an understanding of its meaning. Following Ralph Roy's, Mark Zender sees chab akab, Genesis darkness, as conveying the potential to sire children. It was something that captives were said to lack or be denied. And we often see captives accompanied by statements saying it is his image without creation, without darkness. And the progenerative capacity to which it referred might be better understood as agency more broadly. It appears to have designated the individual as a source of potency capable of bringing forth children, fire, or blood. Captives were placed into a state of abstinence, and their blood was often spilled in sacrifice, but these conditions did not reflect their chab, because they were inflicted upon them from outside rather than originating from within. First penance or creation, Yash Chab, was a rite of passage undertaken by young Maya nobles during the classic period, an event of enough importance to have been performed in front of dozens of witnesses and to have been recorded on a number of stone monuments. As Stephen Houston observes, children as young as 5 years old, both male and female, entered into a new social status and age of responsibility through this ritual. Monumental records of these ceremonies tend to relate to unusual or fraught claims to dynastic succession, such as an individual who would ascend to the throne following the death of his childless half-brother. If such Yash Chab events were therefore seen to bolster claims to legitimate authority, it cannot have been simply a matter of the bloodletting itself, which was almost certainly much more widely practiced by adults in Mesoamerica. Rather, it was likely the communion with deities and ancestors that was accomplished through this act, which would have provided young nobles with privileged access to powerful tutelary gods and forebearers that served to legitimize their authority. This is clearly seen on the so-called Halberg stela that we're looking at here. on which a Maya noble is engaging in Yashchab tu Kuhil, or the first penance or genesis for his god. The young lord is depicted with marks of divinity, a curl in his pupil, a curling element at the side of his mouth, and a central shark tooth-like fang. And he is shown in communion with supernatural beings. These miniature anthropomorphic forms climb along a rope-like serpent that is held in his arms and which rises in front of him. In Maya art, serpents are frequently depicted as portals of communication with the spirit world, and this one is shown to be such by the face that emerges from within its wide open maw. Looking down upon the young lord in the same position that we often see deities and deceased ancestors in Maya ruler portraits. At the point where the body of the serpent rises upward, a crenellated stream of blood flows downward in front of and apparently emanating from this figure. Within this outpouring are the upper bodies of 3 small figures, scrolls of blood flowing from their severed torsos. In performing his first penance or genesis, this ruler has both become the Ba, or manifested image of a deity, and summoned or conjured further divine manifestations through the shedding of his blood. Auto-sacrificial bloodletting performed by Aztec nobles appears to have functioned in ways analogous to what has been proposed for Chab events among Maya nobility. At the time of their election to office, Aztec rulers underwent a period of fasting and penance that included the piercing of their flesh to offer blood to the deity Huitzilopochtli. Moreover, several important monuments prominently depicted the rulers themselves engaging in the act in the presence of a deceased predecessor or a deity. The dedication stone, a relief carved onto a large slab of greenstone, which we see the upper portion of at the left here, features a pair of profile figures perforating the upper portions of their ears with bone awls. Copious streams of blood flow down past the incense burners placed at their feet and into the open mouth of the earth monster on which they stand. Both figures are identified by the name glyphs behind their heads. To the right is Ahuitzot, the ruler at the time this monument was made. And it was presumably made in conjunction with ceremonies rededicating the Templo Mayor. On the left is Tizoc, his deceased brother and predecessor. A similar composition is found on the backrest of the monument, variously referred to as the Temple Stone, the Teocalli of Sacred War, or the Throne of Moctezuma, and we see that at the right. Here, the figures flank a central solar disk containing the glyph for movement, the date associated with the current sun. They hold perforators in front of themselves in preparation to offer their blood. The figure on the right is the current ruler, Moctezuma II, identified by the name glyph in front of his head. The figure across from him is not named, but has the attributes of at least 2 Aztec deities closely associated with rulership: the hummingbird headdress of Huitzilopochtli and the serpent foot of Tezcatlipoca. Thus, on both of these monuments, bloodletting is shown to be an important obligation of the ruler, nourishing the earth and feeding the sun, an obligation that served to connect him to his deceased predecessors and to the gods themselves, who are made present through this act. Further Aztec monuments prominently featured bloodletting as their subject in ways that extended beyond a direct connection to rulership and the legitimization of authority. This is usually conveyed through the representation of a ball of grass into which perforators have been placed, such as the one seen between Tizoc and Ahuitzot on the dedication stone here. And it's also on the upper surface of the backrest of the temple stone. Such imagery appears to have been especially associated with the military orders and warfare. This was also the case among the classic Maya, for whom Munson and her colleagues identified antagonistic statements about warfare and conflict to be the primary context in which bloodletting is mentioned in monumental inscriptions. Drawing on signaling theory, these authors have proposed that auto-sacrificial activities were costly signals, painful and demanding of great willpower, as well as being potentially damaging to the body, and that permanent records of them on monuments serve to advertise the personal commitments of elites within a social milieu, demanding significant sacrifices from lower status individuals in war. Certainly, many images depicting nobles appear to exaggerate the ordeal. On Yaxchilan's lintel 24 that we looked at earlier, the rope that Lady Kabalshok draws through her tongue is as thick as one of her fingers and has extremely long thorns projecting from it. And the amount of blood gushing from the cartilaginous ear tissue of Awitzot and Tizak on the dedication stone, these streams of copious streams of blood from the ear, which doesn't bleed so much, are certainly exaggerations. This is all to say that such records are propagandistic representations rather than objective accounts, and they must be analyzed as such. Indeed, if the preceding discussion has focused primarily on the bloodletting activities of elites, that is because they are the best documented. Monumental artworks and inscriptions tend to have rulers and nobles as their subjects. However, there is significant evidence that auto-sacrifice was practiced by most or all Mesoamericans, at least at the time of the conquest. Early Spanish accounts mention bloodletting as a universal aspect of Mesoamerican religious activity, occurring among the commoners as well as the nobility. For example, Sahagún records that on the feast day of the sun, Nawi Olin, for movement, quote, all the people bloodied themselves and no supplications were then made, but everyone drew blood. Straws were passed through the tongue or earlobe and incense was offered. Everyone did so, none were negligent, end quote. In his Relación of 1612, Tomás López Medel stated that, quote, it was very usual, as I have already said, among the Mexicans and Guatemalans, for all had certain sacrifices and rites, to sacrifice to the idols that they found on the roads, anointing the face of the idol with the blood they drew right there, either from their ears, piercing them, or from their nostrils or tongue, or even from their private parts, according to what others say, so that anyone who passed by any idol and did not offer any portion of blood drawn there from his own body was not considered devout or good, in the same way that we do reverence when we come upon any cross or image on a journey, end quote. Thus, we see individual bloodletting as a fundamental act of worship practiced by or expected of all members of contact era Mesoamerican society, and not limited to the elites. While we only have a limited number of records documenting some classic Maya elites celebrating their Yash Chab first, bloodletting was an important ceremony for all Aztec children, no matter their social standing. As recounted by Diego Duran, recently born infants were brought to the Templo Mayor during the month of Huehuetozotzli, or the Great Perforation, where the priests of Huitzilopochtli would lightly incise the ears and, if the child was male, the penis. This aspect of Huehuetozotli celebrations was not recorded by Sahagún, who instead situates the ritual first piercing of children in a quadrennial ceremony during the month of Itzcali, as part of the festival in honor of the fire god, Xiuhtecutli. All Aztec children who were weaned since the last time the ritual was performed were taken to the temple where their ears were perforated by the priest. And that's what we see in the illustration at the right here. This ceremony ushered these young children, who were notably of a similar age to many of those Maya nobles for whom Yash Chab ceremonies are recorded, into a new status of personhood, marking their transition towards maturation and socialization. In the early 20th century, Alfred Tozer also observed bloodletting among the Lacandon Maya as part of an elaborate ceremony accompanying the dedication of a new god pot, brazier. Tozer, however, speculated that this practice was dying out, as it was only the old men who engaged in it. R. John McGee, who conducted field work with the Lacandones during the 1980s, observed that god pots were painted with dots of a red dye that was explicitly identified as a substitute for human blood, and that older men in the village all remembered making ritual offerings of their own blood to the god pots. One of the only indigenous groups to have remained unconquered and unconverted, the Lacandones live in relatively egalitarian villages in what is now Chiapas. Thus, self-bleeding, which likely represented a survival of pre-Hispanic religious practice, cannot be characterized solely in terms of elite strategies for legitimizing power. The ubiquity of auto-sacrificial activities across classes suggests that the potential for infection or permanent damage was relatively low. Certainly, some bodily treatments had greater potential for risk than others, and some overzealous penitents appear to have intentionally engaged in self-mortifying acts that left their body in tatters. Yet for the majority of Mesoamerican people, this was not the case. Several herbs were known that could have been used to staunch bleeding, treat inflammations, and sterilize both instruments and wounds. Indeed, exactly such a practice was witnessed by the Spaniard Egidio Gonzalez in the 16th century, Nicaragua. Quote, "When the priests give a signal, each man takes a razor and cuts his tongue, turning his eyes towards the divinity. Some pierce the tongue, others cut it in such wise as to cause a great flow of blood. Each man then rubs the lips and beard of the odious idol with his blood, after which the powdered herbs are sprinkled on the fresh wounds. Such is the virtue of this powder that the wounds close in a few hours so that no trace of them is ever again visible." End quote. Perhaps the best evidence that bodily perforations were commonly made without significant adverse health effects throughout all cultures of Mesoamerican civilization is the presence of body ornaments in the material record. Large holes made to accommodate the oversized ear flares in evidence throughout all periods, as well as the nasal and lip piercings worn by a number of elites, would have required regular attention after they were made as they healed and were slowly stretched. Following the ritual first bloodletting of young children by the Aztecs during the quadrennial Itzcali ceremonies, cords of unspun cotton were placed through the holes that were produced. This ensured that the openings in the flesh were kept open and began the slow process of widening them to later accommodate ear ornaments. The spaces in which jewels were to be placed were thus closely associated with the holes from which sacrificial blood was offered. The adornments kept these artificially made orifices continually open and, being made from materials that were themselves infused with tonali, served as permanent tokens of the potency flowing forth from the living body. This indexical representational role played by ornaments is only part of the picture. There was a reciprocal relationship between flesh and jewelry, such that the beneficial emanations from the materials the ornaments were made could also be absorbed by the body. Corporeal holes were not only conceived of as releasing tonali through the blood, but also allowing for its entrance. Discussing the persistence of, quote, superstitions among the recently converted Aztecs, Duran noted the following, quote, "They have introduced magic beliefs even in the perforating and placing of earrings in the ears of women and girls. Let the truth be told. One day I entered a home to visit and console some ailing people during the Great Plague which raged in this year. I found a sick old man seated, wearing some earrings which he had donned on the orders of a deceitful doctor who had made him believe that if he placed them in his ears, he would not die. And therefore, you will see these earrings worn by old women who have almost turned to dust, who believe that their life will be prolonged by wearing them." End quote. Looking past Duran's polemics, this passage points to an indigenous understanding of ornaments as exerting a vivifying effect upon the bodies within which they were worn. Thus, the holes made to accommodate them allowed the ingress of animating forces into the body. This is also seen in Sahagun's description of the initial piercing ceremony. Immediately following the perforating of the ears of Aztec children during the Itzcali rites, which were dedicated to the fire god Xiuhtecuhtli, they were passed over a fire. Quote, and when they pierced the ears of the children, thereupon they took the little ones to singe them. They laid and made a fire and scattered much incense over the flames. And hence it was said, they are singed. The old men of the tribal temple seized all of them. They took the small children and dedicated them over the fire, end quote. This suggests that the holes were made in part to allow for the infusion of the vital heat of the fire into the children. Much as newborn infants were placed next to the hearth for 4 days following their birth to saturate them with its tonali heat. Indeed, holes in the body, the natural orifices that serve as the interface between the inside and the outside, were understood as a sine qua non for life, and the production of them was a metaphor for birth itself. This is seen in birth almanacs from several central Mexican codices, which include depictions of deities piercing infants with bone awls. In the Codex Borgia, the infants are depicted full-bodied, and the fates associated with each cell are indicated by the different deities doing the perforating. In all cases, the awl is held to the eye of the children, suggesting the initial eye opening at birth. This version, the version of the Codex Fagerveri-Meyer, which shows only the heads of the infant held in the hands of the gods, includes one cell in which the awl is aimed at the mouth. And from that emerges a scroll with a maize cob at its end. In this case, both breath and the intake of food are implicated. Marcus Eberl sees the perforation imagery in these birth almanacs as potentially relating to actual treatments of children, including the healing of a clouding of the eyes sometimes experienced by infants. Yet he also discusses these images in relation to the final forming of the infants into fully human beings. Based on a passage from Sahagun's Florentine Codex, Elizabeth Boone has also interpreted these scenes metaphorically, seeing them as reflecting the painful act of parturition, as well as the initial boring and breathing of life into a newborn child by the creator deities. Addressing the newly born infants she was bathing, the midwife would say, quote, thy mother, thy father, Ome Tekutli, Ome Siwa, have sent thee. Thou wert breathed, thou wert bored in thy home, the place of duality, end quote. That is to say, the body must first be perforated to allow animating forces, breath, life, the soul, to enter into it. Likewise, the insertion of precious jewels into holes made in the flesh was undoubtedly understood to have a fructifying effect on people. The wearing of ornaments by Mesoamerican elites was done in part to conflate the adorned individual with the qualities attributed to the precious materials from which the jewels were made, thereby naturalizing their societal claims of authority. However, these objects were recognized to be signs that, like language, could be manipulated and potentially used to misrepresent reality. That is, while jewels were commonly worn as tokens proclaiming the status and power held by an individual, they were not themselves understood to be agents of legitimacy. This is made explicit in the story of Vuku Kakish, or Seven Macaw, as it was recorded in the Popol Vuh, the 16th century book-length creation story of the Quiche Maya. Prior to the current age of man, Vuku Kakish was a false god who claimed the role of sun and moon. To substantiate this assertion of divine status, he points to his glittering, adorned features. Quote, I am great. My place is now higher than that of the human work, the human design. I am their sun and I am their light, and I am also their months. So be it, my light is great. I am the walkway and I am the foothold of the people, because my eyes are of metal. My teeth just glitter with jewels, and turquoise as well. They stand out blue with stones like the face of the sky, end quote. But these ornaments are false signs that do not reflect any actual transcendence. The Popol Vuh tells us, quote, it is not true that he is the sun, this Seven Macaw, yet he magnifies himself, his wings, his metal. But the scope of his face lies right around his own perch. His face does not reach everywhere beneath the sky. The faces of the sun, moon, and stars are not yet visible. It has not yet dawned, end quote. As a pretender to celestial greatness, Vukub Kakish must be defeated to set the stage for the first true dawn, a deed that is accomplished through the extraction of his adornments following a crippling blowgun wound delivered by the hero twins. Although this myth as we know it was recorded in the 16th century, images carved on late formative stelae at the site of Izapa and painted on classic Maya ceramics appear to depict similar stories many centuries earlier. On a dish now known as the Blom plate, for example, which we are looking at here, a pair of blowgun-wielding figures flank a central avian creature perched atop a world tree in the form of a sprouting monstrous skull draped with a bicephalic serpent. From atop a long-nosed head, this supernatural bird has a second head that rises on a sinuous neck formed by linked jewels. A variety of additional jewels are vomited from the long beak of this upper head, signifying the downfall of this creature at the hands of the blowgunners. Although this and similar scenes cannot be taken as directly illustrating the myth of Vukub Kakish as it is recounted in the Popol Vuh, the parallels are striking. Particularly notable is the central importance of jewels to the identity of the celestial bird and the removal of these as the cause of his downfall. In the Popol Vuh, the distinction made between Vukub Kakish's illegitimate claims to superior status and actual lack of spiritual potency is mirrored by the differentiation between the soulless wooden people that existed in the pre-dawn world and the current creation of men with vital flesh modeled from ground maize. Lacking true divinity, Vukub Kakish was an appropriate celestial being to rule over the wooden people who lacked any spiritual understanding, a deficiency further reflected in their physical dryness. As the Popol Vuh tells us, quote, they had no blood, no lymph, they had no sweat, no fat, end quote. Without these fluids closely associated with bodily heat and vitality, the people made of wood also lacked an awareness of the debt that they owed to their creators, to whom they therefore did not offer sacrifices. This displeased the gods, who eventually destroyed the world with a great flood. The wooden people became the chattering monkeys of the forest, a downfall that parallels that of Vukub Kakish. Thus, although it was expected that bodily ornaments announced their wearer as noble, both in the sense of possessing or channeling a concentration of vital energies, as well as in a hierarchical sense related to the political authority associated with such personal potency and charisma, this correspondence was not fixed or absolute. In the case of Vukub Kakish, the wearing of jewels did not correlate to actual divine power, and the result was his being stripped of his undeserved and misrepresenting finery. This mythological tale can be understood to prefigure the actual removal of jewelry from captives taken in war, who, in their defeat, no longer possessed either spiritual or political agency. Ornaments were recognized to be symbols used to point to ineffable qualities that resided within the flesh of the adorned, and there was an abiding desire to bring the outward appearance into accordance with the inward condition. The ornaments placed in bodily perforations could therefore be read as indexical signs, attesting to the legitimized sanctity and authority of their wearers, only as long as they were understood as perpetuating the initial sacrificial act of piercing, the opening of the flesh of the individual to provide egress for the flow of blood and its associated vitality, the very substance and quality that the wooden people lacked in the pre-dawn era presided over by Vukub Kakish. That is to say, in the adorning of the Mesoamerican body, the whole was as important as the ornament, whose role was to keep this somatic passage open while providing a material form to the immaterial forces emerging from it. This relationship between a body ornament and the whole it occupies is unambiguously demonstrated in the use of piercing as a legitimizing ritual. The Relación de Cholula tells us how priests of this important pilgrimage city in central Mexico granted the right to rule to lords from different places by piercing their noses, lips, or ears, as was the custom where they were from. A similar bestowal of authority occurs in the Historia Tolteca Chichimeca,
when the Toltec rulers of Cholula traveled to Chicomostoc, the place of 7 caves, to bring forth Chichimec warriors to aid them in defeating their enemies. Following their emergence from Chicomostoc, several Chichimecs are granted status as lineage heads, acknowledged as possessing legitimate authority by having their nasal septa pierced by the Toltecs at Cholula. These 16th century accounts help us to understand images depicting similar legitimizing rituals that occurred several centuries earlier. Several Mixtec historical codices recount the life of the 12th century ruler of Tilantongo, 8-Deer Jaguar Claw, including how he was granted the right to establish his own ruling lineage by priests from Tolan, the place of the reeds. This toponym is associated with a number of ritually important centers in ancient Mesoamerican political landscapes, and multiple possibilities have been proposed for its identity in this instance, including Tulancingo and Cholula, the latter of which was explicitly identified as a Tolan in a number of sources. Polities carrying the designation Tolan were widely recognized as having a special religio-political status associated with the feathered serpent that attracted pilgrims from long distances and from many ethnic groups. A similar nose-piercing ceremony is shown on a relief in the North Temple of the Great Ball Court at Chichen Itza, likely another Tolan serving the elites of Eastern Mesoamerica. The nose jewel that 8-Deer received was emblematic of his legitimacy, but only insofar as it indexed the sanctioning of his right to rule by a recognized authority. That is, the piercing ceremony itself marked the transference of status, and it is precisely this moment that is depicted in the pre-Hispanic codices. At around the same time in Europe, religious leaders also played a role in recognizing the legitimate authority of rulers. Yet, whereas the crowning of the Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope reflects a superficial and entirely symbolic placement of jewels on the head of the king, the ceremony performed by Mesoamerican priests involves a transformation of status that is brought about through a material intervention into the flesh of the newly recognized ruler. Not simply a matter of the aesthetic sensibilities of the cultures in question, these different approaches towards the ritualized and meaning-laden adornment of the kingly body should be understood in relation to the contrasting worldviews held by these two civilizations. In this paper, I've argued that for ancient Mesoamericans, the holes that were produced in the flesh were as materially important as the jewels that were worn in them. Bodily piercings made to accommodate adornments should be understood as ontologically related to other perforations, namely those made during auto-sacrificial bloodletting rituals. All of these somatic interventions created passages for the emergence and ingress of vital forces, thereby manifesting the potency of the individuals upon whom they were enacted. Jewelry made from materials closely identified with these forces made these claims tangible and visible, and thereby served not only as tokens of wealth and status, but also as markers of personal agency and charisma. All of this depended on an indexical understanding of material signs, in which they not only represent ideas, but are directly produced or affected through contiguity. When this situation was no longer deemed to hold, efforts were made to bring signs back into a proper relation with meaning. That is my talk. I'm happy to take any questions that you have through the chat, or you can raise your hand. And I know that we're short on time because of the business meeting that occurred before the talk. So if we don't have time for questions, then please feel free to email me if you'd like.
Andrew, there was a question in the chat.
How is this related to the teeth inlays of the Maya? I think it's the same idea, right? Whether the jewel is being inserted into the flesh, the soft tissue, or if it's being embedded within the teeth, the idea is to integrate these fructifying special materials into the body of the individual And it's both, of course, a way to show one's wealth and status, but it's also in a connected way meant to demonstrate their sort of charisma or potency, the amount of vitality that they possess in their bodies. So yes, I think it's exactly related.
I have actually have a question, and you started out by contrasting the Judeo-Christian world image, people made in the image of God, and that not connecting that not to body piercing. But there's a lot of, what about any thoughts at all about before the Judeo-Christian world? Not only in Western Europe, but I mean, I'm thinking of Asia, for example, and the whole issue of how to understand what seems to me, at least, the idiosyncratic nature, or maybe it isn't idiosyncratic. I'm not sure. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
I mean, I know very little about body modifications and piercings in Asia or in pagan Europe, but I would definitely say that that has to be taken into account to the worldviews of the people themselves. Likewise,
Well, there are a couple of other questions in the chat.
tattooing practices as well. Yes. Again, there's even less evidence to go by with tattooing. With the piercings, we have the jewels themselves that often survive. With the tattooing, we have to rely mostly in Mesoamerica. In the Andes, is mummification, there's preservation of some tattooing. But in Mesoamerica, it's mostly down to representations. And in those cases, it's difficult or impossible to distinguish body painting, for example, from tattooing. But certainly tattooing occurred and existed. We have that in the 16th century accounts, texts. And undoubtedly, this was also a way to an attempt to manifest inner conditions, the charisma, the vitality of the individual, express them, but something that was often or necessary to renegotiate, to constantly adjust if needed, if the conditions changed. For instance, if a prisoner is taken captive, that his status is diminished. So how would that have been played out in tattooing? We just don't have much to go on with that evidence. But the overall idea of body modifications relating to this process of signification in which indexicality is central, I think holds in that case as well. And are any of these practices still used? By these practices, do you mean body piercings? I mean, I think yes, we see plenty of body piercing, and not just in Mesoamerica, and cultures around the world. And a lot of it, I think, is a sort of linked to a modern primitivist movement, the sort of a revival movement. So I wouldn't necessarily attribute continuity into all of it. But I think that there is certainly the possibility of seeing some affiliation or sense of expression of the inner vitality of the person in the large, wide gauge, very visible piercings that you see. But I think if we're talking about in terms of indigenous groups, the Spanish conquest and conversion was unfortunately extremely successful in especially wiping out these very visible markers and signs of indigenous belief, and piercings were one of these that were like very visible tokens of indigenous culture that were a focus of the friars in eradicating in the conversion process. So I think that there's been a substantial break between past practices and contemporary practices, but there are definitely revivals that that have been occurring in the past couple of generations. I think I see some hands. I don't know if those are related to questions, or if so, please go ahead.
If you have your hand up,
Oh, I'm sorry, Lynn, you had something in the chat. Anything to indicate piercings of elite were valued more strongly than non-elite? Well, certainly the materials that were placed in the piercings, you know, indicate that disparity of value. But if you're asking about the holes themselves, I mean, I guess we can say that as well, because 8 Deer getting his nose pierced in this special ceremony by you know, specific holy person, this priest at Cholula, makes that hole more valuable than the average hole in the non-elite body. So I think there were certainly efforts by the elites to make everything that they did
listening to this.
more valuable and important.
It's like an extra credit lecture. Like we have.
Were wearing earrings ever just social or always void related? I mean, I don't think that there's a distinction between the social and the void related. I just merely mean to emphasize the role of the void in the social, in Mesoamerica, that I think has often been overlooked because of its double immateriality, that it doesn't survive in the record. It's an absence in the material record that gets overlooked. But I think that the void participated in the social. It was part of the social. It was always social. Love the correlation of the precious stones that signified their beliefs and showcase their power. Turquoise stones, for example, which is greatly seen as artifacts. Thank you.
okay, I think we'll say thank you very much to Dr. Finegold for his lecture. I thank you all for participating, and we hope to see you at our next lecture. So I would say again, thank everybody. And ladies, to everyone, from Ilimani Castro to everyone, thank you, super interesting. So again, thanks to our speaker, and thank you all for attending. Bye-bye.